Caleb Rivera sat alone on the bench, his gaze fixed on the expansive garden before him. His once jet-black hair was now streaked with silver, and his face, though handsome, showed the signs of a man who had spent much of his life under the sun. To the casual observer, he might have appeared like any other man enjoying a peaceful spring afternoon, but for those who knew him, something was clearly wrong. Who could have guessed that Caleb was going through something really tough? His usual warm, gentle smile was gone, replaced by a serious look on his face. His deep brown eyes, which had once been full of intelligence and humor, had lost their sparkle. They reflected the broken pieces of his life. He was a man who had been through a lot, staring at the blooming rose bushes and vibrant spring flowers, unable to take comfort in their beauty. Despite the April sun bathing him in its light, Caleb couldn't shake the cold that gripped him. The warmth touched only his skin, failing to reach the chill that had settled deep within his soul. He shivered despite the bright day, the warmth of nature unable to offer any real comfort. His hand tightened instinctively around the gift he held was a bonsai tree, her favorite. It represented a milestone in their marriage, a shared memory, and now a symbol of what was lost. He felt a surge of emotion as he stared at it. He'd never imagined he'd be that man. Caleb's attention shifted to the couple walking nearby, arm in arm. Even in her early 50s, Elle still had a beauty that could turn heads. Her long black hair, streaked with silver, fell gracefully around her shoulders. Him with a clear purpose, inspiring him to conquer the world. Now, they only served as reminders of his heartache. And then there was Billy, the man who had taken Caleb's place. Billy was probably about 20 years younger than Isabel, with a tall and slender frame that seemed out of place next to her. He had an odd, almost awkward look about him. "Oh, Billy," Isabel gushed, her voice soft and adoring. "I can't wait for our date on Saturday. Do you have something special planned?" Billy blinked, clearly caught off guard, but quickly covered his confusion with a sly grin. "Yes, something special," he said, smirking as he let his hand slide down her back and boldly squeezed her rear. His intentions were. Isabel squealed with delight, playfully swatting his arm. "Oh, Billy Collins, behave yourself," she giggled, before leaning in to plant a passionate kiss on his lips. "That should hold you until Saturday," she said, beaming up at him. Then she nestled her head against his chest, sighing contentedly as they embraced. Caleb watched in silence. Struggling to make sense of the scene, his wife of 32 years was acting like a lovesick teenager with another man. It was almost too surreal. His emotions churned violently, anger, sadness, and disbelief. He couldn't imagine sharing her. The thought had always been abhorrent to him, against everything he believed. Yet here he was. It wasn't like he was choosing to lose her. It was more like she'd been taken from him by circumstances. It felt like a bad dream, like he was trapped in a nightmare he couldn't escape. He'd lost her, and deep down, he knew she wasn't coming back. The slow, agonizing death of their marriage had consumed him, leaving behind a deep, unrelenting coldness in his soul. 8 long years had passed since he first learned of her betrayal. In the last year and a half, it had become his painful reality. His mind understood how they had gotten here, but his heart refused to accept it, making his torment worse with every passing moment. Caleb forced himself to think of happier times. A soft smile tugged at his lips. His lips curled up in a smile as he thought back to the first time he'd met Isabel Flores. She was with her family, spending their summer in the south of Spain at 20 years old. Caleb had been overseeing the construction of her family's villa from the moment she spoke. She had captivated him, even after the work was done. He found reasons to linger near the 18-year-old beauty. Most people assumed it was just a summer fling, but Isabel's parents had seen the truth long before the young couple did. They could see the depth of their daughter's feelings and knew that Caleb was equally smitten, despite their reservations about the couple's youth. Isabel's parents recognized the bond that was forming when summer ended and Isabel returned to the States. Caleb was determined to follow her. He began the long, arduous process of securing a visa, fueled by the hope of reuniting with the woman who had stolen his heart seemed like a distant memory now. Isabel's absence from Caleb's life during the visa process had only made him want her more. His passion for her grew stronger, and soon she persuaded her father to step in and speed up the process with the Flores family's influence. He got his visa much quicker than he had thought. Before long, he was on American soil, working hard on a construction crew. 2 years later, they married, marking the beginning of a 32-year relationship. Caleb sat on the bench, lost in thought. A faint smile crossed his face, reflecting on warm memories of their early years. But his smile faded, replaced by sadness. As the memories shifted to more recent times, he thought about how it had been 8 years since Isabel's diagnosis with early-onset Alzheimer's. She was only 44 when she got the news. In the years that followed, they both had to face the fear and uncertainty that came with the diagnosis. They spent many nights in prayer and sharing their tears with family and church members. They eventually had to face the hard truths together. They made some big changes 4 years ago. They sought advice from all sorts of people, their priest, their adult children, close friends and relatives, doctors, and legal experts. They had always been capable, and the business had done well under their leadership. Caleb handed over the reins of the family construction business to their sons Alex and Leonardo. He stayed on the payroll to ensure their insurance. They stayed together, offering financial security as they faced the future with their lives on a different path. Caleb and Isabel focused on spending as much time together as they could, though they weren't wealthy. They had accumulated enough to live comfortably, and Caleb persuaded Isabel to indulge in their shared dream of traveling. Reluctantly, she agreed, and they embarked on a year of adventures. The joy of travel was short-lived, though. Isabel began having what they called bad days. At first, it was manageable, but it got worse. The odd bout of disorientation or confusion at home, but as these incidents became more frequent during their trips, things got pretty rough. Caleb winced at the memory of trying to comfort Isabel during a terrifying episode in Rome. It was the last straw. From that moment on, they never left Brownwood again. Their ranch became their safe haven. It wasn't one of the grand Flores estates that dotted the area, but it was a comfortable 200-acre property with a dream house they had built together. It became it was a refuge from the world. Caleb grimaced as he thought about the day everything changed. It had started like any other morning. They had shared breakfast, talking quietly as they always did. Isabel had left to get the mail, one of her favorite daily rituals. Walking down the lane to the mailbox was a small but cherished pleasure. The October wind was brisk that morning, hinting at an early winter. Caleb had chuckled as Isabel started out the door wearing nothing but her nightgown. "My love," he had called out playfully. "You forgot something." She flashed him that brilliant smile that always melted his resolve. Then, with a quick trip to the bedroom, she returned wearing cowboy boots under her nightgown and sweatpants she had pulled on beneath. She'd even thrown on a thick fall coat over the entire outfit. Her eclectic fashion choices were one of the early signs of the disease's progression. Caleb had learned to accept this with a bittersweet smile from the kitchen window. He watched as Isabel strolled. As she walked down the lane, her long hair and gown fluttering in the wind, it was a view he'd seen countless times, but this time it would be different. He turned away for only a moment, just long enough to clean up an orange juice spill, and when he looked up again, she was gone. Panic surged through him as he bolted outside, shouting her name, but there was no response. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. He dashed back into the house, searching every room, but it remained unnervingly silent. His heart pounded as he returned to the lane. He looked around for any sign of her, calling her name again and again. He could hear his own voice echoing in the empty space. His mind was racing, trying to remember everything from that morning. He hoped for any clue that might lead him to where she had disappeared. He remembered seeing a black pickup truck driving past that morning, though he hadn't seen it stop. The fear that Isabel might have been abducted was gnawing at him. He went back to the house. He immediately called his sons and daughter, and within moments he was driving along the county road, searching for any sign of her. For hours the family scoured the area with no success. Finally, as dread began to consume him, Caleb reached out to the county sheriff's office, Sheriff Dawson, a longtime family friend. His friend was well aware of Isabel's condition, so he arrived at the ranch without hesitation, bringing several deputies along to assist in the search. By late afternoon, Dawson had enlisted help from the Brownwood Police Department, and soon after, a half-dozen officers joined the search. Night had fallen by the time an officer stumbled upon Isabel. The duty officer found Isabel huddled inside an old, decrepit machine shed several miles from their home. She was curled up beneath discarded feed sacks. They rushed her to Sacred Heart Hospital, where doctors treated her for exposure. Caleb recalled the heart-wrenching moment he saw her in the emergency room. It was a heart-wrenching moment when he saw her in the emergency room. His heart broke all over again when he saw her hair was wild and disarrayed, partially covering her face, and saw the haunted look in her eyes. But the moment she recognized him, she collapsed into his arms, sobbing. "I'm so sorry," she cried, clinging to him desperately. "I don't know what happened. I got lost, and I couldn't find you." He stroked her hair gently and whispered, "I've got you now. You're safe." She sobbed. "I kept running and running until I couldn't go on. I found the shed and tried to stay warm, but it was so cold." Caleb held her tightly, rocking her like a child as her tears soaked into his shirt. "It's over now," he murmured softly. "You're coming home." It had taken nearly the entire night to calm her down as he held her. He came to the painful realization that their lives were about to change forever. In the weeks that followed, the difficult discussions began. It was clear that Isabel could no longer stay on the ranch safely, but the decision to it wasn't easy to move her. Caleb spent many nights holding her as she cried herself to sleep. He only let himself shed his own tears after she drifted off. How do you fight something like this? How do you protect the ones you love from an enemy you can't see? He knew it was a battle they were destined to lose. They both knew it. Alzheimer's was relentless, stealing away everything and leaving nothing but heartache in its wake. A week before Isabel was set to move into Brookhaven, she had another episode. Isabel had become hysterical at the mere thought of leaving their home. Caleb held her close, their tears mingling as she begged him not to send her away. For a brief moment, he almost relented, but the following morning, Isabel woke up screaming. She was panicked and furious at the sight of him. She didn't recognize her husband and was horrified to find herself in bed with a stranger. Caleb's heart shattered. The decision he'd been trying to avoid was now unavoidable. It was time. 18 months had passed since that agonizing day, and that Isabel's condition had gotten worse really fast. The first few months were the hardest. Caleb had visited her 2 or 3 times a day, and their kids came by almost every day. The hardest moments were when she didn't understand why he had to leave when visiting hours ended. Caleb would fight back tears as she clung to him, crying and begging not to be left behind. At least she wasn't tormented by those emotions anymore, he thought bitterly. It was a small blessing that she no longer remembered them. To himself, he knew he should be grateful, but it still hurt. Isabel's laughter suddenly broke through Caleb's heavy thoughts. It wasn't that her laugh surprised him, she had always been so full of life. It was the emptiness that followed it now. Once her laughter had the power to brighten even his darkest days, now it only left him feeling numb. 10 months ago, Billy had entered their lives and brought with him a pain Caleb could never have anticipated. Each day, Caleb had tried to help Isabel remember who she was and who they were. On the good days, when she remembered him, he could reclaim his beloved wife for a few precious hours. On the bad days, when she didn't remember, she would drift back into Billy's arms. It was a slow, excruciating battle that Caleb had ultimately lost for the past 4 months. Isabel hadn't remembered him at all. Daniel Whitman, a recent transfer to the Brookhaven Mental Care Facility, had suffered severe head trauma in a car accident 3 years ago. Leaving him with Daniel was mentally impaired, which was frustrating, but not the real issue. Daniel was just the latest version of Billy Collins, and Bee's mind was the original Billy. That man had been her high school sweetheart more than 35 years ago. Now, it seemed like any tall, skinny white man could assume that role in her fractured memories. Caleb thought bitterly. He let out a deep sigh and scolded himself. "Stop it," he chided. "They're just as sick as Isabel." He tried to push the image of the gaunt 60-year-old man from his mind. Some guy with dementia, usually Isabel's interactions with her Billy, were pretty innocent. They resembled the sweet romances of a starstruck teenager, kisses, giggles, and playful touches. Sometimes things went further, like they had with Stephen. Caleb squeezed his eyes shut, desperate. To keep his mind from drifting back to that memory, his stomach tightened as he fought to block it out. Thankfully, he was pulled from the dark thoughts by the gentle clearing of a woman's throat nearby. "Is this seat taken?" she asked. Caleb smiled. He recognized the voice immediately and opened his eyes. He looked up and saw an attractive woman in her late 40s standing before him. She looked much younger than her age, with long blonde hair cascading over her slender frame. "Mrs. Orrin," he greeted her weakly, offering a faint smile. "Cassie," she corrected him with a playful grin. "Caleb," he teased back. A wider smile formed on her face, her eyes sparkling with affection as she returned his grin. "We've had this conversation before," she said, her tone light and warm. "It's Cassie. Her playful energy is contagious." For a moment, Caleb felt the darkness lift slightly. She had become his angel, his beacon in the darkness that had slowly consumed his life. She had been there for him during his lowest moments, offering comfort when he had none left to give himself. However, Caleb's mind couldn't help but drift back to that terrible day, the day everything changed. He had once been a regular. A visitor at Brookhaven arrived at the nurse's station as usual before heading to Isabel's room. He knocked and stepped inside, trying to persuade her to spend time with him. However, when he opened the door that day, his entire world came crashing down. Isabel was lying there on the bed, her eyes closed. Isabel's eyes were closed, her face a picture of pure ecstasy as she softly moaned. Her smooth, tanned body was writhing beneath Stephen Black, who was between her legs, obliviously pleasuring her. The sight froze Caleb in place. His wife was caught in the throes of passion with another man, her body moving rhythmically. "Yes, Billy," she whispered softly. "Be gentle. You're the only one for me. I love you." The words cut through Caleb like a knife. Isabel threw herself back into bed, covering herself with the sheets. Stephen was still on the floor, dazed and confused. "Who are you?" Isabel shrieked, her voice laced with fear. "Why are you in my room?" Caleb stumbled backward into the hallway, his heart hammering in his chest. His vision blurred, his hands shook uncontrollably. His breathing was ragged. He barely made it outside into the garden before he collapsed onto a bench. He was overwhelmed by his emotions. He knew she had fallen in love with Billy again, but seeing her with him, watching her give herself to another man, was more painful than anything Caleb could have imagined. He'd always thought of himself as the dependable one, the rock, the one his family could count on in a crisis. But now, sitting alone in the garden, he felt his strength slipping away, leaving him hollow and broken. His heart was torn open, bleeding into the empty space where his life once thrived. He was a good man, a loving husband. Caleb sat alone on a cold concrete bench, his body racked with silent sobs. He had no idea how long he had been sitting there, lost in his grief, until he felt the warmth of soft arms wrap around him. He looked up to see Cassie's tear-streaked face as she pulled him closer, holding him while he wept. If it hadn't been for Cassie, Caleb thought he might have cracked that day. Stephen Black had been transferred to a facility in the city, Brookhaven. Like many other care homes at the time, it lacked clear policies on patient intimacy. After that incident, everything changed. New guidelines were established, and all patients were required to wear ankle bracelets with tracking devices. Yellow lines were added to the floors to prevent wandering. Throughout it all, Cassie had been there for him. He was there for him, like an anchor in a storm. Caleb knew then that she was more than just a friend. But how much more? He felt guilty. Had he allowed the hope of something more to lead him to this decision? His eyes began to water again as shame crept into his thoughts. What am I really the kind of husband I should be? He asked himself. He'd promised God he'd stick by her through thick and thin, so how could he just walk away? Cassie's gentle voice pulled him out of his downward spiral. He glanced up at her, his eyes filled with sorrow. It's our 32nd anniversary, he managed to whisper. Cassie nodded, and he could see that she was holding back her own tears. She was crying for him, for his suffering. I know, she said softly. That's why I'm here. It had been weeks. Since he last saw her at her father's funeral, she'd been surrounded by her kids and their families, and they hadn't had much time to chat. Even in the middle of his grief, Caleb had noticed that Brookhaven had felt somehow quieter since her father passed. The man had often sat at his bedroom window weeping and calling out to the wife who'd left him years ago. It had been a haunting and tragic sight, regardless of the man's past. I didn't get a chance to speak with you much at the funeral, Caleb said softly, breaking the silence between them. Cassie gave him a weak smile. It's all right, Caleb. I had my family around me, so it was bittersweet losing my father. In many ways, it was also a blessing. Caleb nodded quietly, letting her words sink in. He had heard bits and pieces of Cassie's difficult past, but he knew this wasn't easy for her to admit. My father wasn't a good man, Cassie continued. Her voice was steady but laced with old pain. I've told you some of it before. He was an alcoholic. He was abusive. He was so horrible that he drove my mother away. Unfortunately, she left without taking me or my brothers. These last few years, the only thing he remembered was the woman he drove away. He called for her constantly. She paused, letting out a heavy breath. Now he's finally at rest, but I'm still battling some guilt. I didn't expect to feel relieved when he passed. Caleb reached out and touched her hand gently. Cassie, I understand more than you know. We all face impossible situations. When they end, it's only natural to feel relief in this situation. It doesn't make you a bad person. She gave him a grateful smile, her eyes warm with understanding. That's why I'm here today. Over the past 6 months, we've become good friends. I knew you'd be here today on your anniversary. Caleb looked down at the small bonsai tree in his hands. He had been holding it tightly, the delicate leaves trembling slightly under his grip. After a few moments, Cassie asked, "Is that an anniversary gift?" "Yes," Caleb murmured. "They say it might be therapeutic. I thought she'd like something she can care for, so I even brought the little tools she'll need." But then his voice wavered and tears welled up in his eyes. "It's more than that, though. It's also a farewell gift. I filed for divorce this morning." Cassie placed a comforting hand on his arm. "Oh, Caleb. I'm so sorry. I know she doesn't realize what she's doing," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I can't sit by and watch her give her love to another man. The only other option would be to stop coming here, but that would feel. It's like abandoning her, but it also feels like abandonment. What happens now?" she asked gently, sensing the depth of his internal struggle. Caleb's expression hardened as he steeled himself for what lay ahead. "The courts will appoint someone to represent Isabel's best interests. It'll likely be either Alex or Leo. I hope it's Leo. He's had the hardest time accepting my decision. He understands why I'm doing this, but he doesn't fully support it the way Grace and Alex do. Maybe it's because he's not married." But he sighed deeply. "Leo's always been protective of his mother. I won't deny Isabel anything. Her care will be our top priority, no matter what." Caleb grew quiet, staring down at the wedding ring on his finger. He absently twisted it over and over, his voice barely a whisper. When he spoke again, after the divorce was finalized, he said, "I'll apply for an alimony." Cassie could see the shame he was wrestling with, and her heart ached for him. I feel like such a hypocrite, he continued. How can anyone pretend that a 32-year marriage never existed? A year of marriage never existed, she said softly, her voice thick with empathy. Caleb offered a weak smile, grateful for her presence, but still weighed down by the consequences of his choices. You being here helps me more than you realize, Cassandra, he said. Cassie raised an eyebrow at him, and Caleb let out a small, sad chuckle. He corrected himself gently, a hint of a smile returning to his lips. His words drew a smile from her in return, a warm, lively expression that seemed to brighten her entire demeanor. Her eyes sparkled, and the quiet, consoling presence she had held moments before shifted into something more vibrant, full of life. Have I ever told you what brought me to Brownwood? He asked her in a light, playful tone, as though trying to ease his mind from its heavy thoughts. Caleb smiled, recognizing the distraction for what it was and grateful for it. You've shared bits and pieces, he said, leaning back a little. I'd be honored to hear the rest. Cassie chuckled softly and gave him a playful wink. Well, since you already know most of it, I'll keep it. Caleb nodded and listened closely as she began. Like Isabel, I fell in love when I was 18. Cassie started, but while she gave her heart to a good man, I ended up falling for the local bad boy. He got me pregnant, and although he married me 4 years later, he ran off with his secretary. He left me broke and alone with 2 small kids. She paused for a moment, a trace of the old pain evident in her voice. She crossed her face before continuing, That's what brought me to Brownwood. I got a job at the battery plant and met my second husband, Henry Orman. We were married for 15 years before he died of cancer. Since then, I've been looking for someone special to spend the rest of my life with, though I haven't quite found him yet. Caleb couldn't help but grin after years of dealing with such situations. With evasive clients and unreliable contractors, he found Cassie's directness refreshing. She was a woman who knew what she wanted and pursued it with determination. I knew Henry was a good man. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you. Cassie replied with a gentle smile. He was a good man, and now that he's gone, I know he'd want me to keep living. My life, she turned toward Caleb, her eyes filled with compassion. Caleb, from what you've told me, I have to believe the old Isabel would want the same for you. Her words echoed the plea his daughter Grace had made to him months earlier. Papa, please, she had begged. Stop doing this to yourself. Watching her with him day after day is killing you. Mama would understand. Please, Papa. He'd felt the sting of Grace's words, but he knew she'd spoken out of love. The truth was, Isabel would have understood years ago. She'd made him promise to continue living his life when the time came, even if that meant moving on without her. His mind wanted to honor that promise, but his heart hadn't caught up yet. She does, Caleb murmured, his eyes drifting back to Cassie. At least she was there with him. She made him promise to keep living after she was gone, at least mentally. Cassie prodded gently, and Caleb sighed. He looked down at the ground, struggling to find the right words. I'm finding it hard to keep that promise. I know she's not in her right mind anymore, and that helps soften the pain a little, but watching someone you've loved your whole life give their love to another is almost unbearable. It's hard to describe how it feels when someone you love gives their whole life to another person. It's almost unbearable. Cassie put a hand on his shoulder. Her touch was light but full of comfort. I'm so sorry you've had to endure this, she said softly. But Caleb, you will get through this, and one day you'll love again. I know that from experience. Caleb looked at her. He was grateful for her kindness. Cassie, I need to thank you. You've been a godsend to me. I can lean on you. I need you to know how much that means to me. But I also have to confess that my feelings for you aren't completely honorable. Cassie's eyes widened in surprise. Before her face broke into a wide smile, she chuckled softly. Her laughter was warm. And genuine, Caleb, she said teasingly. I would have been offended if they had been completely honorable. Caleb stared at her, unsure whether to laugh or remain silent. Cassie cleared her throat and met his gaze with a serious, steady look. I think of you as a good and honorable man, she said. You're someone I'd like to get to know better. As a friend, my second husband was a good man, but he wasn't exactly a proper gentleman. You, Caleb Rivera, are the epitome of a true gentleman, and I'd be lying if I said that didn't intrigue me. Her words left Caleb momentarily speechless. Cassie had a way of making him feel seen, understood, and appreciated. He hadn't planned for any of this and hadn't expected it. He thought about exploring whatever lay between them no longer seemed impossible. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something new, something unexpected, and perhaps something healing. Her smile lit up her face, making her eyes glimmer with a mix of warmth and challenge. She was daring him to look away. It was as if she held him captive in that moment, and Caleb couldn't help but feel the intensity of her gaze. The intensity of her gaze made it clear to Caleb that Cassie was ready to hear what he had to say. He began, I'm only saying this because you've taken a huge step toward moving on with your life. I know I haven't hidden my feelings for you, but I would have never encouraged you until you were ready to move on. Caleb's voice was low and honest as he continued, I won't lie. Spending more time with you has been on my mind. It may have influenced my decision. My decision. In some way, she quickly shook her head, her expression tightening in concern. Oh no, Caleb, please don't think that, seeing the pain in her eyes. He instinctively reached for her hand, which she took in both of hers. She sighed deeply, and when she met his gaze again, her eyes were full of understanding. Caleb, she began. You're a very attractive man. I'm sure you've had women show interest in you over the years. Are you saying you never found any of them attractive? Attractive, he said slowly. It's not that there were women I found attractive, but I never acted on those feelings. You haven't with me either, she replied. There's a reason we haven't spoken in weeks. I knew you were getting close to making some difficult decisions, and I wanted to be sure I wasn't influencing them. It's normal to feel desirable when someone you like shows interest. It helps people get through the fear of starting over. If it hadn't been me, it would have been someone else who made you realize you're still attractive to others. Cassie shifted closer. Her voice was soothing yet firm. Tell me, Caleb, before you filed those divorce papers this morning, did you plan to call me and ask me out tonight? Caleb shook his head. His expression was serious. No. All I could think about was my marriage. That's exactly where your focus should have been, Cassie said. It was a big step, and it needed your full attention. What about tomorrow or later this week? Had you planned to reach out to me? He hesitated again, then said quietly, no, it was too soon. She nodded knowingly, and even if you had wanted to call me, how would you have done it? I've never given you my number. Caleb paused, then smiled faintly as he remembered you owned the Cassie Cat Diner by the battery plant. I guess I would. I've tried calling you there, Cassie said with a warm smile. Her eyes were soft. Caleb, you're a smart man, but even if you had called the diner, you would have only reached one of my employees. I never gave you my personal number because it wasn't appropriate. I've been careful not to do anything that could harm what we have, even if it stayed just a friendship. Her voice softened as she held his hand tighter. Over the coming months, Caleb, you might feel guilty about moving on, but I want to be clear that I had nothing to do with your decision to end your marriage. If you think otherwise, it could ruin any chance of something between us. That's why I've kept my distance. She leaned in closer, her hands cupping his face with tender care. She turned his head gently, forcing him to meet her gaze once more. Her fingers brushed lightly across his cheek, and the sincerity in her eyes spoke louder than words. Caleb, there is life after this. She said, her voice steady. But it might not feel like it now, but there will be joy and love again, whether that life includes me or not. Well, that's something we'll have to figure out together if it comes to that. She let her words settle between them for a moment before continuing. But for now, you need to grieve. You need time to process everything. I won't reach out to you again until you feel ready to talk. If you want to call me as a friend, I'll be here. Anything beyond that, well, that's up to you, Caleb. I'll wait for you because I believe you're worth waiting for." Her final words hung in the air, filled with a quiet strength that Caleb admired. She wasn't pushing him, she was giving him the space he needed, offering him the chance to heal without pressure or expectation. For that, he felt something deeper than gratitude, he felt hope. Caleb sat in silence for a few moments, absorbing the weight of their conversation. Then he smiled. "What number should I call?" Cassie's face lit up. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small makeup bag. After a moment of deliberation, she selected a tube of lipstick. Every time she glanced at Caleb, her smile widened. It was hard for her to apply the lipstick with a steady hand. Finally satisfied with the result, she pulled out a pen and a small piece of paper. She wrote down her number with a playful flourish. She pressed the paper to her lips, leaving a bright kiss mark behind. She handed it to him with a smile that was both sweet and mischievous. "Call me," she said softly, adding a wink for good measure. Caleb took the note, feeling a sense of warmth and renewal blooming in his chest. He realized then that there could indeed be light after the darkness. Each patient brought challenges for the night shift. What began as calm could quickly spiral into chaos when a patient awoke disoriented and unsure of where they were. Adding to the difficulty was her unofficial role as a chaperone monitoring wandering patients. Most of the time, they were innocent, but on rare occasions, they weren't. Daniel and Isabel were the pair that kept her busy. Their little escapades had become almost a game, like two mischievous children sneaking around. The anklets that each patient now wore had helped curb their wanderings, much to their mutual dismay. As Claire approached Isabel's room, she heard the soft sound of crying. She felt her heart sink and hurried inside. Isabel was sitting on her bed, her body trembling as she stared at a small bonsai tree. Tears were streaming down her face, tracing paths of sorrow down her once beautiful features. Claire moved to sit beside her, wrapping a gentle arm around Isabel's shoulders. "Isabel, what's wrong?" she asked softly. "I don't know, Isabel," she whispered softly. "I look at this tree and it just makes me so sad." CLA glanced at the small tree and immediately understood that the staff knew the sad story behind it. For the past 2 months, Isabel had been meticulously caring for the bonsai, and despite everything, it had begun to flourish. "Would you like me to take it away?" Honey, Claire asked softly, offering a comforting smile. Isabel's response was immediate and a resounding no. She cried out, then softened. "I think it was a gift, but not from Billy." Claire tilted her head, concern etching her features. "Do you know who gave it to you?" "Silence, my love. I'm giving you the only gift I have left to give you your freedom. Goodbye, my darling." Claire felt her chest tighten as she placed the sea back down. She gently pulled Isabel into her arms, holding her as the confused woman wept. Isabel's sobs gradually slowed, exhaustion overtaking her as she cried herself into silence. CLA tucked her in carefully, smoothing the blankets over her. "Do you want me to leave the door cracked open?" CLA asked in a soft whisper. Isabel nodded, her face pale and drained. "Yes, please," she murmured. CLA gave her one last comforting glance before heading back to her station. The hallway fell silent again as Isabel curled into her pillow, staring at the faint silhouette of the bonsai tree. The shadows in the room concealed the tears that once more began to fall from her eyes. As the darkness enclosed her, she was the only one who heard her quiet, desperate whispers, "My love, where are you? Please don't leave me."